The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to this free webinar on the 5 Conversations Framework and how you might implement it in your own workplace. Tim Baker's my name. I'm going to give you a quick 30-minute introduction into how you might implement this and what sort of support might go with applying it. This process, the 5 Conversations Framework, is very popular. I've had inquiries from all over the world, and people are using it cross-culturally and for lots of different ways. Now, I do say at the outset that it can be a new approach to appraising employee performance, but it can also be used as an enabler to improve the traditional performance review. So in other words, you could use it as an approach to actually create a better performance review. So it can be used one or the other. So just keep that in mind as I go through this presentation and think for yourself in your organisation, is this about a replacement or is it about enabling a better performance review? So it might be something you'd like to think about. In 2013, I wrote the book, The End of the Performance Review, and I was ahead of the curve there. And my assessment was that performance reviews in their current state weren't working particularly well. So the whole idea is that I put together a new approach, and that's what this will be about today. All right, so 3 things out of this short, sharp session. And of course, if you've got questions, comments, observations, type them in the question box there on the right-hand side. I'd be happy to answer those. Do that when you think of the question rather than the end, because I won't be leaving the 5 minutes for questioning at the end because we're moving at a fairly rapid pace. You can always send me an email at the end of this process as well. But 3 things we're trying to get out of this. First of all, what is the 5 Conversations Framework? So let's talk about that. And then why is it an effective change management strategy? Let's talk about that. And then how do you actually go about implementing it in your workplace? So 3 key things that I hope you've joined to find out about today. Now, we all know that the surveys that are out there would show us that the majority of people are disengaged in the workplace. Now, whether it's 70% or 60% or whatever, I think you'd all agree that there's a high level of disengagement in the workplace, and the surveys tend to suggest that. So the question is, how do we get people to be more engaged in the workplace? Well, the first important thing is that the person who's disengaged has a responsibility to be engaged. I mean, that's the first point, isn't it? It doesn't matter what you do, it's a decision that's made by the person as to whether or not they become engaged in the work they do. But there are certain things that we know for sure that will help with that engagement. So when we talk about engagement, of course, I think we know what we're talking about, but essentially engaged employees are committed to their work, they're actively making contributions, perhaps even proactively contributing to organisational performance. Of course, the worst of the worst is the not actively disengaged. Now, these are people, of course, who are trying to drag everyone else down in the organisation. So you've got a number of subcategories in there, but essentially what we're trying to do here is to engage more people in the work that's being done. Now, we do know from research that if we can engage a higher percentage of the workplace, the good news is there is a correlation between higher levels of engagement and higher levels of revenue. So not only is it just a happier workplace, it's a more productive workplace, and that's essentially important because people say, well, why bother? Why should I go to the trouble of engaging people? Well, there's a productivity imperative involved in that as well. So the good news is that there is more and more research that's demonstrating that engaged employees are likely to be more productive. Now, I guess you don't need research to know that. I think it'd be fairly obvious if people are proactive, they're more energized, they're more involved in their work, then it's probably likely that they're going to be a little bit more productive as well. But at least now we've got research to back that up. Now, the 5 Conversations Framework is now it'll come up on you. There it is. It's up on your screen now. Now, you can see there how it works. I'll run through it with you very briefly, and then what I'll do, of course, is explain to you how it works, or sorry, how it can be implemented. So you'll notice that over on the left-hand side, you've got 5 months. So the idea is that there'd be one conversation once a month over a 5-month period. Now, these conversations, I should point out to you, should not necessarily be longer than 15 minutes. I've had feedback that sometimes they do last longer than 15 minutes, but they're designed to be short and to the point. But of course, any conversation can go on longer than 15 minutes, and that's a decision that's made by the manager and the person involved in that conversation. But ultimately, month 1 is around climate review. So you'll see in the middle column there, it tells you the topic of conversation. And over on the right-hand side, it tells you a little bit about what that conversation's about. So the climate review conversation is about 3 things: job satisfaction, morale, and communication. So we actually start that conversation by asking people on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how do you currently rate your job satisfaction? And then the person will give you a score, let's say a 6. The next question is why, which is obviously a more important question. So it's getting a little bit of feedback about how people are feeling. We all know that job satisfaction ebbs and flows depending on what we're doing, but what it does is it gives us a rain check. It gives us a quick snapshot about where our people are at. And of course, as we know, organisations spend thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars a year on engagement surveys and the like. And the argument here is by using the 5 conversations framework, we can really do the same sort of thing by having a conversation about it. And people might say, well, surely people will be a little bit more honest online than they would face to face. Not necessarily the case. Who's to suggest that people completing surveys online are in fact being truthful? So we start off with a climate review conversation, and then month 2 we move on to a strengths and talents conversation. Now, the strengths and talents conversation is building on what people are naturally good at. So what are people's innate talents, and how can we utilize those more effectively in the work that they do? Now, that's important because there's a high correlation between what people enjoy and what people are good at. The research demonstrates the link between the two. So the very first question in the strengths and talents conversation is, what parts or what aspects of the job do you enjoy the most? And of course, that's a lot easier question than to ask people what their strengths are. People will mention what it is that they enjoy. Hopefully it's something. And then, of course, it can lead on to a conversation about how better to utilize that strength in their current and perhaps even future roles. So the first 2 conversations create an upward spiral of positivity, if you like, and conversation 3 is probably the closest to the performance review, which is opportunities for growth. So this conversation is very much around 1 and no more than 2 areas that perhaps can be worked on over the next, several months. And so we've talked about strengths and we've talked about opportunities for growth, and out of that comes a conversation 4, which is a learning and development conversation. So you can imagine that there will be some sort of development or learning opportunities that might emanate out of conversation 2 or 3, and so that's why we separate that as conversation 4. Now, learning and development may not necessarily be about sending people off to training courses. It could well be about coaching people. It could well be about mentoring. It could well be about explaining things clearer to people. So a lot of this learning is on the job, informal. But of course, it might also imply that there is some sort of, practical, course that people might attend. So conversation 4 is very much about the individual and their own future development, whereas conversation 5 is about innovation and continuous improvement. So this is really around the notion of what we can do to improve the workplace that we have we currently have. So we want people to talk about that, bring their ideas to a conversation, and those, not everything, of course, that comes to a conversation is going to be useful, or indeed even practical to implement, but there will be some good ideas, and the key is to tap into that. And you can't do it unless you have a conversation about it. It's very unlikely that people will just spontaneously come up to you in the corridor and give you a good idea about how the workplaces can be improved. It normally has to happen because of a conversation. So in a nutshell, that's the 5 conversations. Now, what I also strongly recommend is that the individual prepares for those conversations. So what happens is that they don't come into a conversation blindsided. They actually know the questions that are going to be asked of them, so that when they are asked, they're not sitting there dumbfounded and don't have a clear answer for it. So part of the process is for the individual to be well briefed before they come into the conversation with their manager. So I don't know if there's any questions that anyone has about the framework itself, but if you do, go to the right-hand side and click on the question box. Happy to take questions. Moving right along, and mindful and respectful of your time, here's how it can be implemented. Now, there's 6 stages or 6 phases, if you like, in the implementation process. And I'll run through those briefly with you so it gives you a sense of how it works. Now, if your organisation wants to take this on board, you know, this can be applied to your organisation. So I'm just giving you a kind of a generic overview, but some of this might be applicable and some of it not, depending on, you know, subsequent discussions. So let's have a look at the steps involved in that. So step 1, as you can see there, is an assessment. So what we do up front is we do a benchmarking exercise. So we have 50 statements that are done online, which are pretty much based around a lot of the concepts around the 5 conversations framework. And what that does is give us a very clear benchmark about where the organisation's at. Things like morale, trust, communication, those sorts of things are covered. So we've got a benchmark that's useful, because one of the things we've got to try and do is demonstrate to people that this thing works. And the only way we can do that, of course, is to have quantifiable data. So that's why we collect a survey data up front. So it doesn't take long, it takes 10 minutes to do online. It's very much a process of agreeing, disagreeing, or neither agreeing nor disagreeing with 50 statements that happen to be grouped around the 5 conversations concepts or conversation framework. So once that's done, we've got that information and that data. The next step is that we need to induct the workplace. And what that entails is 2 hours of induction for managers. You know, why are we doing this? What are the 5 conversations about? Why is this a useful exercise? What will you get out of it? And a whole range of other things that are very important. Now, this is important because whilst you might be sold on it, the reality is we need to make sure that people understand the value and importance of this. Because what happens is busyness gets in the way, and people, of course, forget to do this. Or they could think that perhaps it's a nice to do rather than have to do. The other thing is, of course, the people on the receiving end of the conversation need also to understand what's going on here too, so they need to be inducted. But we can do that in a short, sharp session, and we run those sessions back to back basically, and make sure that we can get everybody through a process and we're ready to go. We also will share the data from the survey with the groups too. So in other words, they get some sense of where the organisations are at the beginning of the 5 conversations framework. The next step is that what we do, and these aren't necessarily steps, but one of the learning interventions that I've found is very, very powerful in this whole process is group coaching. So what that entails is throughout the process, there needs to be support for managers. These are the people having the conversations, or at least facilitating them. And in order to do that, what I've found that works extremely well is if you get 4 managers in a room, maybe 4 or 5, and you give them an opportunity to share with the other 3 or 4 managers what they're doing. What are some of the things that are working for them? What are some of the things that are not working for them? What questions have they got? And so as a coach, my job then would be to facilitate a learning environment where each of those managers is learning from each other. This is enormously powerful and works extremely well because peer group learning is one of the untapped aspects of learning, in my view, in the workplace. So we create that environment because people can listen to me or even you, but the truth is if they're listening to the peers, the people that are sitting next to them, and they say, oh, I've got the same issue as they have, or I thought I was the only one that had to learn to listen a bit more effectively, but I can see there that other people have, and even better, there's some tips on how to actually improve that. So that's an important plank. The other thing is each month there is a broadcast like I'm doing now, 30 minutes on each of the 5 conversations. So that is put into the schedule, and each month, at the end of the month, there is a broadcast on the next conversation coming up. Now, why do that? Well, it's exclusive to that conversation. It prepares people, and it also psychologically makes sure that everybody gets the thing done before they move on to the next one. So there'll always be people dragging the chain, and people may leave their conversation at the last minute, but if they know there's a webinar coming up on the next conversation, they kind of, it just pushes them into action and realizes that they've got a deadline that's got to be met. So the broadcast will look at the specific conversation, the questions associated with it, some of the issues that come out of it, and how that's managed. All right, so that's another support tool. And of course, the implementation, which is really the 5 conversations themselves, is the real learning. And a lot of people say, well, you know, we've got to prepare people. People actually will learn more by having these 5 conversations than they will by the other things, because there's trial and error, they're trying things out, some things work, some things don't. So all of those things are, you know, the 5 conversations that's why it's an effective change strategy, because it's very practical. And people are talking about very real things in those conversations. The other support tool that we use is an online web-based management system. And so this system is a system where people can record their preparation. So those people that are starting out in the conversation, you know, they can then record and prepare how they're going. When I say record, they can write down a few comments that they might make in order to get themselves ready for the conversation. And that there's an automation tool in there. Can press a button, it sends an email to their manager asking them to, you know, I'm ready for my conversation, I've done my preparation. So it's an efficient way of being able to basically manage the whole process of the 5 conversations. And of course, if you're in HR, what it does is it gives you that opportunity to get an overview of who's doing what in the organisation. In terms of, you know, who's completed what conversations and what are some of the plans of action that have emerged from the conversations themselves. So it's a really useful tool that, and everyone, of course, in the organisation has their own portal. And then you'll notice it's cyclical. So what happens at the end is that we assess the organisation again, exactly the same questionnaire that we implemented at the beginning. And so we now have a before and after snapshot. And what that before and after snapshot will do is to demonstrate if, and it's normally true that there is improvement, and surprisingly significant improvement in some cases, between where it was and where it is now. And of course, that pretty much validates the approach and lets people know that obviously it's working. We've got data to prove it, and of course you can use those surveys moving forward to benchmark that for other conversation, you know, if you're moving on. So the idea might be to start with 5 conversations in the first year, but I would like to think that, you know, 10 short, sharp conversations, that is 2 rounds of the 5 conversations a year, is not too much of an ask. And you know, when you think about it over the course of a year, it's not, depending of course about how many people might be directly reporting to you, but the process is about changing habits and getting managers and employees to communicate more effectively based on their developmental needs and performance needs. So as I said before, it can either replace the performance review. As you can see, many of the topics are part of what a normal performance review would be about, except it's spread out in a more manageable process. Or, as I said before, it can be an enabler to improve a better process of conversation. So has anyone got any questions at this stage about the process, bearing in mind that I've only got a very short time with you, and I appreciate the time and I want to respect that. So if you've got any questions, just type them in. Happy to try and respond to them in due course. All right, all good so far? Excellent. Okay, let's take to the next level. Just to give you an example, when I talk about the before and after snapshot, here is a client. Obviously, I've taken the client's name off it, but I just wanted to demonstrate to you how this might work. And you can see there that we have a survey 1 and survey 2, and I'm just going to go through that and explain that to you. I've just got a question here I'm going to deal with first. Thanks, Fiona. How does the remuneration review fit into the cycle? Excellent question, Fiona. I would have that as a separate conversation. I would not be trying to weave that into the 5 conversations, nor indeed would I even weave that into the review, performance review. I think that's a separate conversation that occurs. I think the 5 conversations guides and informs that decision, as would a performance review. I note in America that it is very commonplace to have the performance review and the remuneration occur at the same time. The problem, of course, with that is you don't produce a great conversation, because obviously people are well aware that the remuneration or future remuneration is very much dependent on how they perform in that particular review. So I would separate them. I hope that's helpful. And so the process that we've got here is a guide and information to help that. Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I'm glad I was able to help you. Now, you can see here, coming back to this survey, look at the difference here. And this is real life data. You know, this is from an organisation. I have not received enough feedback for my work from my boss. Well, in survey 1, the aggregate result was 36%. Now we have a much better result of 72%. So significant doubling of performance. I feel my boss is getting the best out of me in my current job. Big improvement there as well. I've discussed strategies to grow and develop in my current role with my boss. Big improvement there as well. And it goes on. Here's another couple. My boss has implemented some improvements from his or her team to improve my team's way of doing business. Yes, evidence of that. The boss is open to improvements. I suggest there's evidence of that too. That's after 5 conversations. Now, you can imagine what that would do across an organisation in terms of lifting engagement, morale, trust, a whole bunch of factors that would improve that. So it gives you some, and then of course there's an opportunity for people to make comment as well, and you can see there's some comments here that people have made about the approach. Question, as you can see from the first one, questions are not intrusive and could be delivered in a friendly manner. They provided an opportunity to learn more about an individual team member. So you can see that, you know, the conversations help to break down barriers in communication, enable line managers to have more open conversations with team members. The 5 conversation framework has fostered more impromptu conversations in the team. And that's a very important one. In other words, trust level builds, people are talking to each other more so than they would normally be the case. Overall, the 5 conversations framework assisted in improving engagement, trust, and relationships. So clearly there's evidence that it works. You know, if I could just, and of course I've implemented this in organisations with enormously low morale and some with reasonably high morale, but you'll find that the rate of improvement is significant whichever way you go. So look, just to sum up, and I realise that there might be a couple of questions here before we wrap up at the top of the hour. Some advantages of implementation. Well, it's highly likely you'll implement higher levels of engagement. The disadvantages is that the engagement levels will remain the same if you don't do anything about it. One of the advantages is that you will no doubt, and this is one of the big factors in the process, there's no doubt that more trust will develop across the organisation. And of course, if you don't do this, you are probably perpetuating a them and us culture, which is pretty common across public sector, private sector, and not-for-profit. You'll foster an open communication culture versus a closed communication culture. So there are significant differences here. It can be an attraction and retention strategy. Okay, so attraction as in people, when people come on board, perhaps even might be young, they get the opportunity to working with their manager more closely. And of course, retention can be a result of having a better relationship with their manager. Of course, if you don't do it, you might continue to have higher than normal turnover. It can improve, this is one of the great features of it, it improves leadership capability without sending people to a training course. You're actually improving leadership by getting people to do what we probably think they should be doing anyway, which is having developmental and performance conversations on a regular basis with the people that work with them. Whereas if you don't, then you probably continue the command and control leadership style that continues. So there's lots of benefits, I think, there for you to give it a go. You're certainly not going to go backwards, and if anything, you'll go forward at a significant rate, no doubt. All right, so just greater productivity, of course. All those things add up to greater productivity, and of course, if you don't do it, it stays the same. So there are some benefits, of course, of going down this road. So are there any other questions, folks, before we wrap up? Because I'm happy to deal with any that come forward. Okay. One thing I'd like to offer you, because you've taken 30 minutes of your busy schedule on a Wednesday, I'd like to offer you this opportunity. If you would like to talk to me personally about the 5 conversations and how it might be implemented in your workplace, I would be happy to do that. Now, if you're in Brisbane, I will come and see you. And unless you're going to fly me wherever, I can talk to you on the phone about this, and I'm happy to do that. And you've probably got a few questions you'd like to think about how you do that. There's my email address and my phone number, so you can contact me via email or phone number, and I will be sending you a copy of these slides and the recording as well. So you'll get a copy of these, but if you make contact with me, I'd be happy to talk to you about how you could implement this in your own workplace. So that's about it from me, folks. I don't see any other questions there, so I think at this stage I might just sign out and just say thank you very much for your involvement. And as you know, you can contact me via email or telephone, and I'll be happy to take your call and talk to you about the 5 conversations. So thanks everyone, and have a fantastic rest of the day. Thank you and goodbye.